Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome to today's guest, one of our favorites, Ron Brownstein, and welcome as well to tonight's wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle. Hoping those who celebrate have a meaningful Yom Kippur, and on Wednesday we begin the week-long Harvest Festival of Sukkot. While both this Wednesday and next Wednesday are holidays on which we will not be having programs, we will have a program next Monday and next Tuesday, which are the intermediate days of the holiday. So I hope you'll join us. On Monday, we have Harry Dunn, one of the U.S. Capitol police officers who was on duty during the events of January 6th. He became a very important voice testifying to those events in front of the House Select January 6th Committee. He also testified at the 2022 trial of the Oath Keepers for seditious conspiracy for their actions relating to the attack on the Capitol. He's written a best-selling book called Standing My Ground. It should be a great program with Pat Morrison. And on Tuesday, we are going to be having a special memorial at the top of the program to David Lehrer. It is the one-year anniversary since his death, and we'll be joined by his son for some words about David. And then we will proceed to listening to Jennifer Rubin in conversation with Warren Olney talk about the election's home stretch. We hope that you'll all join us, especially to give tribute to David Lehrer. Wishing all who celebrate wonderful holidays in the coming week. Now I hand the program over to Larry Mantle, host of Southern California's longest talk radio program, now almost 4 decades old. Larry knows more about a wider range of subjects than anyone I have ever met. He's won tons of awards and it is highly respected both for his depth of knowledge as well as for the breadth of his knowledge. Please welcome Larry Mantle. Larry?
Janice, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back. I appreciate being a part of America at Crossroads, particularly to talk with Ron with just about 3 weeks remaining before the presidential election. It seems like it's taken forever to get here, and yet it's come so fast at the same time. And I'm looking forward to hearing Ron's expert analysis this evening. Mel, thank you so much, and Zev, of course, too. And I just want to take a moment because I know next week we'll all be paying tribute to David Lehrer, who we lost almost a year ago. And it's hard to imagine we wouldn't have this series without David and Janice, of course, and Zev and Mel, who worked so hard on this, but David, just an indispensable part of the years of building America at Crossroads, and a very personal friend of mine and someone I miss pretty much daily. And thankfully, we'll get a chance next week to pay tribute to him a year after his passing. Ron Brownstein, well known to those of you who've been following America at Crossroads, or if you watch CNN or you read The Atlantic, you know Ron Brownstein. He's a frequent guest on this series, and in fact is going to be back shortly after the election to talk about the results. He's the News Network senior political analyst at CNN, senior editor at The Atlantic, author of numerous books, 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Ron, so good to get to talk with you again.
Hey, Larry, anything going on out there? We can
just a couple of things at about 100 polls a day, it seems.
Yeah.
So as you look at the 7 contested states in the presidential race, I think it's remarkable how we're within the margin of error, it seems, on all of them. You're the one who has remarkable recall of all the previous elections, it seems, during your lifetime. Have we been down this road before?
Yeah, it is extraordinary, right? I mean, on the one hand, the number of swing states has really dwindled. 40 states have voted the same way in each of the past 4 elections, at least. It's more states than voted the same way even Franklin Roosevelt was president. There are only 7 states that the two sides are contesting. The rest of the country is kind of interested bystanders to all this, although they have ways to plug into it. Yet all of them, those 7, are now absolutely on the knife's edge. Maybe in 2000, I was interviewing Karl Rove recently, and he was reminiscing about how many states they were either defending or they thought they could, tilt their way that now we would not consider. I mean, they were worried about Tennessee then, and Arkansas, and they thought they could break through in Oregon. So I think there were about 10 states in 2000 that finished within 3 points of the national average, which is basically a dead heat. And that might be the last time. But, this many states, this close, is truly extraordinary. And it's not as if all of them are static. It's not like that we haven't like exactly recreated 2016 or 2020, but there is offsetting movement among groups within the state that is leaving us in this, absolute knife's edge kind of position.
As you look at the polls, and I know polls have attempted to become much more sophisticated about
Yeah.
who's using, very few landline users. They all tend to be quite older. But are there holes in the polls, so to speak, or do you feel like there are so many of them now that you really can get solid results through averaging?
Well, the honest answer is we know after the fact, right? I mean, that basically in 2016 and 2020 polls underestimated how many non-college white and rural voters Trump would turn out and thus underestimated him. In 2022, polls underestimated the extent of the Democratic advantage in white collar suburbs, and underestimated them. It's unlikely that polling is, exactly, we're talking about states that right now are within a point. It's asking an awful lot of polling to tell you which side is ahead in a 1 point state. And I'm not sure it has it all right. What I do know is that from talking to a broad array of people working on Democratic campaigns and working on Republican campaigns, there is a sense that the first 2 weeks of October have been better for Trump than for Harris in the battleground states, and that they have pretty uniformly moved a little toward him. I mean, it's not vast movement, but it is movement, and that he is driving more of the campaign dialogue in the last couple weeks, particularly on the air, through his advertising, even more than what he is doing in his appearances, essentially running that textbook campaign. One Republican this week, cited Arthur Finkelstein, who was kind of the godfather of right-wing, Al D'Amato kind of era conservative framing of elections. And, they're basically running the campaign they've run for decades. Essentially, Kamala Harris is a liberal who's weak on crime and immigration and is not going to keep you safe and is, kind of out there extreme on cultural issues. And they are just pounding her with that. In the battleground states. They're not getting vast movement, but they are getting some movement. And it's not clear her response has been as effective as we'll talk about. I do think there is some evidence even tonight that they are starting to recalibrate. But I think there is a sense among Democrats, not that these states have moved out of reach, particularly Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but that she has to kind of reassert herself in order to win them.
Yeah, Ron, I wanted to ask you about the advertising because we see in the polling that the social issues are not as big a thing as the economic ones in immigration. And yet, as a sports fan, I constantly see
Yeah.
a Trump PAC's ads referring to crazy Kamala and her support for funding of gender
Yep.
centered care for those who are incarcerated and, really attempting to show her as way far out on the left. So what are your thoughts about that? Is that polling doesn't seem to bear that out, but are they tapping into something, do you think, with those kinds of ads?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think that has been a punch. I mean, I hate to use sports analogies because the stakes are so high and it kind of trivializes it. But with that ad in particular and the kind of the general argument, they have they have landed a punch. Now it's not a knockout punch. But I think, everyone would agree that Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are closer than they were in late September. And they matter above all for Harris. The question of like, what are Democrats have been responding with? They've been responding with, well, we got to get past this negativity and turn the page. Or Trump's tax cuts favor the rich and not me. They have various men making that case, as you've probably seen also on those same, ESPN or Fox or TBS, where you have a team from one of the states that are, one of the seven are still in the baseball playoffs. You see a lot of these ads. And that's probably not enough. To me, the riskiest decision that Harris has made, and the one that I think that they are recalibrating, is that they have focused much more on reassuring voters about her than they have about trying to remind them of all the risks that go with Trump. And that was very clearly the emphasis we can talk about later in the big media swing that she did. The podcasts, The View, Howard Stern, Univision, 60 Minutes. She was very good at kind of conveying personal relatability. Essentially, I thought the macro message in all of these appearances was, I have lived your life, so I get your life, so I know what we can do with public policy to make your life easier and more secure. And I thought she did that pretty well, especially on The View. What she didn't do was really drive a coherent message about Trump. And the idea that a second Trump term would expose the country to all sorts of enormous and even unpredictable risks and chaos and disunity and conflict, that message has really fallen away. And I think starting tonight in Erie, Pennsylvania, the campaign says she is going to begin to try to put that back more front and center, which I think she has to do. I mean,
Yeah, at the convention, Ron, she did make that message about chaos and
yeah,
all the things, trying to say, look, remember, there wasn't just an economy, but there was all this discord and all these 4 years under Trump of serious problems in the country. But she's dropped that message, you're saying, up until...
I think that message has receded and been sublimated. Look, to me, and this starting last December, I wrote about this, maybe even November, when Biden was still in the race, the canary in the coal mine is voters' retrospective view of Trump's presidency. Okay. His retrospective job approval has been rising. In that NBC poll done by the bipartisan team of Public Opinion Strategies, which is Republican, and Peter Hart, which is Democratic, they've been doing it since the 80s. On Sunday, they had Trump's retrospective job approval nationally at 48%, which they pointed out was higher than his job approval at any point when he was actually president. Another bipartisan team, which is interestingly the teams that are actually polling for the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign, a different pollster in each of those companies, are polling for the Wall Street Journal, right? And the Wall Street Journal poll came out Friday in the 7 swing states. Trump's job approval in 6 of them was at 50 or above. Okay.
Wouldn't that be consistent, though, Ron, with every former president? Wouldn't you
No,
see
I
you
think
took job approval at the end of the term versus 4 years or 8 years later? Wouldn't it be higher?
They do all go up. They're not all running for president again. And I think basically what it tells me, and I think other pollsters will tell you, that his retrospective job approval is going up because people are viewing him through the lens of the things they're disappointed in about Biden. Like, they're basically saying groceries were more affordable and the border seemed more under control, right? But Larry, there was a reason when people were living through those actual circumstances that his approval never reached 50%. In fact, he's the only president ever whose approval never reached 50%. It's because there was a lot of other stuff that went along with Trump being president, beside eggs being more affordable at the grocery store.
And people don't remember all that.
And that is what
they were upset about.
That's why I think the debate was so damaging for him. It was not only that she did well, it's that the debate reminded everyone of what they didn't like about Trump when he was president. And I think they have let that thread go. Now, whether they have let it go too long and allowed him to shift the debate toward this idea that he's strong, he can keep you safe, she won't. We'll find out. But I do think I can tell you that among people running Democratic campaigns, there is a near universal belief that if you run this final weeks on conventional issues of like who's better for your bottom line, it's very hard to win because, most people think they were better off when he was president, rightly or wrongly.
Let's talk about the gender.
But there is another path that is centered on, do you really want this guy to be president again?
Let's talk about the gender gap, which seems unprecedented, at least in most of our memories. And it's fascinating to see, Trump is hitting all these, for lack of a better term, bro-oriented podcasts, going after young men, for many of them for whom the economic and immigration issues are top of mind, and who for lack of a better term, are very dissatisfied what they see as a sort of a feminization of the country.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of a macho culture that's come up in response to this. And then you've got Harris, who's been doing shows like The View and podcasts that are aimed at women. She's done general things as well, and is going to be on Fox News with Brett Baier. But what are your thoughts about each of them sort of, catering to that sort of very gender-focused electorate?
Well, first of all, what it tells you, I think, is that they both view they both consider that there are more voters who are deciding between each of them and the couch than they are kind of going back and forth between Trump and Harris. I mean, they're both looking to talk to what should be their base, to reach people who, when we think of undecided voters, we often think of people who are virtually certain to vote but are uncertain who they're going to vote for. I think what each of them going to their respective gender corner tells you is that they are probably more focused on people who are pretty certain who they would vote for, but are uncertain whether they would vote at all. And they're trying to kind of enlarge that universe. The
Why did
gap,
Trump, though? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish
I
your
was
thought.
gonna
But
say,
I'm just
the gender
wondering why
gap right
Trump gave
now,
up on suburban white women who
yeah,
helped him win 8 years ago.
right. But they have really moved away. So like the gender gap right now is not it's big, but it has been big. Biden won women by almost 15 points, by about 15 points, depending on the data source. Trump obviously wins men by double digits. I think most people believe Harris is going to have to do a little better with women than Biden did, because it's unlikely she's going to do quite as well with men. I mean, she's got problems with Latino men in particular. That's going down. That she's not going to match what he did last time. There is probably going to be some erosion among black men, although we don't know how much, and it is one that she's really focused on, in the final weeks. And there'll probably be some erosion, as you point out, with young white men, but it is virtually certain she's going to run better with college-educated white women, the classic suburban white woman. Don't forget, the Dobbs decision did not happen until after 2020. People forget that all the time. And in 2022, in the states that matter most, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, I'll throw in Arizona, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate all ran better with college white women than Biden had 2 years earlier with abortion there. It's not clear that she can avoid some erosion with black and Latino women. I mean, right now, polling is showing a little slippage there, not as much as among the men. Young women, she's going to do really well. And what I've just been kind of looking at is what is often the case. I mean, particularly if you believe, as I do, that her clearest path to 270 is still through Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. There's a really big group of voters in those states, probably the biggest single block in most of them. It's working class white women. It's not the college educated suburban white women. It's the non-college, white women who Bill Clinton era, they used to call them waitress moms. And they are a group that mostly votes Republican on a national basis. They mostly vote Republican even in these states. But whether Democrats lose them by a little or a lot, is often decisive. Obama lost them by a little in 12. Hillary lost them by a lot in 16. Biden lost them by a little less, somewhere in between Hillary and Obama in 20. And he won all back. He won those three states back again. And I think that, for Harris, matching what Biden did among them or even improving a point or two is probably what she's going to have to do to hold Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
Ron, what did you think of former President Obama's comments to black men a few days ago, which have gotten a very mixed response, essentially saying, essentially paraphrasing, don't be misogynist, support Kamala Harris. And what do you think of that approach?
Well, first of all, it isn't fair to single out black men and say 70% of white men without a college degree are going to vote for Donald Trump. Hispanic men have fallen to basically a 50-50 group at this point. And college educated white men are another critical, constituency. So I don't think it's fair to just single out black men, but I do think it is consistent with the view of many Democrats I've talked to about how to push down these Trump numbers is essentially to make it socially unacceptable for more of these black men who might be open to him. Look, black men, like Hispanic men, like non-college white men, really pretty much, and like most of the electorate, they are feeling squeezed by higher prices. I mean, it's not necessarily that they're, all in on like Trump saying Haitians are killing, the pets of their neighbors and eating them. It's what you have seen throughout American history. When people feel like the incumbent administration hasn't delivered for them economically, they're open to the other side, and that is the biggest factor in black and Latino men. I mean, there is also, there is certainly
Immigration too.
yeah, immigration, and there's a receptivity to Trump's kind of macho strongman imagery. All that's real. I still think
What
the evidence is the biggest factor is economic. So, but Democrats have a lot of hope that Trump's polling among black men will not prove as strong on election day as it does now for two reasons. One, because Republicans don't have a lot of experience finding the two young black men on the block in Detroit who probably want to vote for Trump. And second, because they think there's going to be a lot of peer pressure from all the women in their life saying, how can you really do this? And I think Obama really rung that bell in a way that is going to play out across kitchen tables, in black families between now and election day.
So you're saying maybe he was talking more to black women in that message, even though he was formally addressing it to men, but it was trying to build peer pressure in the home.
I think they think peer pressure in the home is critical. I,
Okay.
I know they
Let,
think peer pressure in the home is critical.
let's talk about immigration,
And
right?
by the way,
Because
in reverse, in college white families, right? Just real quick before you get to immigration. I mean, college white women are going to vote for Harris at something approaching 2-1, the best Democrats have ever done among college white women. College white men, they don't think so much about how Biden has performed on the economy either, even though they're probably the most likely to own stock of any group in the electorate, and they, should be kind of pleased by that. But they're pretty negative on his economic performance, same reason everybody else. Prices up. I mean, Democrats are hoping that the women are like, you can't do this. Like, you cannot vote for a guy who might ban abortion nationwide and is a racist misogynist. So there's going to be a lot of those conversations going. And conversely, all of these things. One last point. The non-college white women I mentioned before, who are so important in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, a quarter or more of the electorate, bigger than any of the other groups we're talking about, they are the most open to Democrats of any man in their life, as people point out. Their husbands, the men they work with, their pastors, they live in kind of Foxland. And can the ones who are like, Trump is not acceptable, I don't want someone who is going to bring this level of chaos to our country, can they hold out against all the men in their lives saying, we need a strong guy to keep us safe?
Ron, I do want to talk about immigration because, and you'd be much more knowledgeable about this polling, but just what I've seen indicates there's a fair amount of hawkishness among Latinos on immigration. We tend to think of Latinos as being monolithic and so pro-immigrant rights that border security isn't important. But I think we're seeing in polling that that's not the case, and it is an issue even among African Americans, particularly men. And I wonder, Kamala Harris is kind of in a difficult position because it seems to me the vice president has to be careful not to alienate the progressive, wing of her party and the Democratic base on this, but she knows that immigration is a really big concern. She's trying to walk that line, and I wonder if it's enough that she's going to get people who are deeply concerned about immigration to feel they can trust her on that.
So here's a really good concrete example of what I was talking about before about striking the right balance between reassurance and risk. First of all, immigration is, as the political scientist with the $10 word, it's a thermostatic issue in public opinion. I've been writing about it since the early 1990s, since Prop 187. I've been writing about polls about it since then. And consistently, public opinion on immigration moves in the opposite direction of policy from the incumbent administration. So when Trump was in office, it moved left. Under Obama and Biden, public opinion has moved right. Latinos are not exempt to that. Now, Harris, understandably, given that the border is probably the number 2 issue behind inflation, where people give the Biden administration its worst marks, her focus has been almost entirely on reassurance, on basically convincing the country that she is tough enough to keep them safe at the border. And you remember how, Larry, you remember how they used to joke about when Giuliani was running for president, Rudolph Giuliani, a Giuliani campaign sentence was noun, verb, 9/11. Like that was like every sentence. I kind of feel like you could say the same thing about Harris and immigration with the Oklahoma Senator James Lankford, who put together the bipartisan deal that Trump torpedoed. It's like every sentence about immigration is noun, verb, Lankford. Like that's what she says, because her main goal has been to reassure people that she's tough enough to keep them safe. But what's been missing there? What's been the price in that focus on reassurance? Donald Trump is actively, relentlessly promoting one of the most radical policies by a presidential candidate in my lifetime, which is the militarized removal of 11 million people from the country. He says it's 25 million, by the way. Using they have specifically talked about using the National Guard, federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, round up millions of people, put them in internment camps, and then constantly fly them out of the country. She is not, as far as I know, apart from one passing veiled reference at a Congressional Hispanic Caucus dinner, challenged him on mass deportation, including at a Univision town hall last week when she was questioned by a woman whose mother would have been subject to mass deportation. She chose not to bring it up. And again, this is, I'm not saying these are easy choices, and it's easy to, sit here in the bleachers and yell at the pitcher. But the fact is that in a lot of ways, they have emphasized reassurance in a way that has given Trump a pass on some of his most extreme and radical proposals in a way that he is getting the best of both worlds. He is energizing, without doubt, his culturally conservative white base with unbelievably vitriolic rhetoric about immigrants, which, as I point out in a story in The Atlantic a couple of days ago, draws on what we've seen from the 19th century, going all the way back to the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, the Chinese. Tens of millions of Americans, their grandparents or great-grandparents, face the same allegations that Trump is now leveling against immigrants. But he is doing all of that. He is not being challenged. He is energizing his base, and he is improving among the Latino voters who would be the principal targets for this policy. And I would say in part because no one is pushing back and no one is telling them what it really could mean for them. It's not just her. I mean, I don't think Ruben Gallego is doing this. I don't think the culinary workers in Nevada are doing this. Sort of like a party-wide conclusion that they can't fight Trump on this ground. And as a result, you see support for that going up, right? I mean, we're now getting majority support for mass deportation. I don't think that survives an hour. I don't think that survives the first picture of a mother with a child behind barbed wire in a camp in Texas.
And my voters realize that's never going to happen. And so even as Trump says that, they just take it as hyperbolic rhetoric. They don't really believe that
they don't believe
you're going to deport all those millions of people.
No, but he's going to deport a lot of people. And he's going to deport them in a very militarized way. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you talk to pollsters, even the limited share of Latinos who know about this don't believe it will happen. In fact, you saw some polling over the weekend. The majority said it would not affect me. 1/4 of Latinos live in a mixed status family. Think of all the outrage there was when there were 4,000 to 5,000 kids separated from their parents at the border. There are 4 million U.S. citizen kids with at least one undocumented parent. You're talking about even a fraction of those is child separation at an industrial scale. And no one's kind of raising an alarm. I mean, Harris isn't, other Democrats aren't. It's kind of striking, very striking to me. It's a big choice, and it's one that goes to this belief that reassurance has been more important than risk. And I'm not sure that's the right calculation. I don't think they think it's the right calculation necessarily.
Ron, let's take some of the 7 states that are a toss-up at this point. Let's talk about Michigan particularly. You've got a significant Arab American vote in Michigan, and they've been fairly democratic. With, of course, what's happening in Gaza and with Hezbollah, what's your sense of what's happening with that segment of the electorate in Michigan?
First, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, important to understand, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin have been really highly correlated in how they have voted. They have voted the same way in every presidential election since 1980, except one in 1988, when two of them voted for Bush and Wisconsin voted for Dukakis. They have even voted the same way, Larry, in every gubernatorial election since 1994, except one in 2014.
Wow.
They have tended to move together. They are demographically very similar. 90% of the electorate in Wisconsin is white, roughly 80% in Michigan and Pennsylvania. They are similar, and they have very small immigration population, similar elderly population, similarly college, non-college. They're all right about 1/3. So there's a lot of history. By the way, just Michigan and Pennsylvania alone, just talking just the two of them, they voted the same way in every presidential election since 1940, except one. They've only separated 3 times since the Civil War. They've only separated 4 times since the Republican Party exists. So I tend to,
it's all one to you.
Past performance is no guarantee of future results, and that could certainly happen this year. I mean, it's been 80 years, so like it could be time for Michigan and Pennsylvania to separate. But I tend to think they're going to move together. Michigan is a puzzle on the one hand. On the other hand, it's probably the most Democratic leaning of the 3. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer just won by 10 points in the state in 2022. I think the Muslim population is not going to vote for Harris at the same level they voted for Biden. It's just not going to happen. I think there have been some efforts to say, Trump is going to be no more of a source of restraint on Netanyahu. He's going to be, even less than Biden and Harris have been. And for good measure, Stephen Miller is tweeting pictures of pro-Palestinian rallies and saying ICE will be busy in 2025. But I think enough voters in that community want to make a statement that she is not going to get what they have gotten in the past. And the question is, can she get more in the white collar suburbs? Oakland County, the suburbs around Grand Rapids, Oakland County, in the 80s, Macomb County, which is a Detroit suburb, became famous as the wellspring of the Reagan Democrats, the blue collar white Democrats who abandoned the party and moved right and have stayed right ever since. But in modern politics, equally important is the suburb directly to its west, which is Oakland County, which is the white-collar suburb of Detroit that has become more and more Democratic. Whitmer crossed 60% of the vote there in 22, which is inconceivable. Republicans won at every election from 68 to 88. And that's where they're going to have to go. And that's probably the story in Pennsylvania, too. I mean, Hillary won the 4 suburban counties outside Philly by 190,000 votes, lost the state narrowly. Biden won them by 290,000 votes and won the state narrowly. Harris is probably going to have to win them by, something very close to that, if not more, to win the state. And maybe there's a little more to squeeze out of youth turnout in these states. But I think the Muslim thing is going to get worse for her. It's not going to be back to where she needs. And, the black vote in Detroit and Philadelphia may not be all the way back. It's hard to believe it will be, given how disappointed people are in their economic situation after 4 years of Biden. Again, lots of achievements, this tide of investment in green energy, all the manufacturing plants that are coming online, all the infrastructure projects that have been completed. But most, the common lament you hear from Democratic pollsters is they cannot do a focus group without usually a Black or Latino man saying he's a racist, he's horrible, he's disrespectful, he's misogynist. But if I'm being honest, I had more money in my pocket at the end of the week when he was president. And that's what they're up against. White collar, white America also is unhappy about inflation, but it isn't as the shoe doesn't squeeze as tightly. And they are more free to vote. They are more free to vote on the other aspects of Trump and Trumpism. Like I haven't written this, but I kind of feel like her campaign is heavily focused on cutting her losses in the place where Democrats do badly. And that to win, she may have to shift more to magnifying her strengths in the places where they're doing well, with a clear message of what a second Trump term would win that could bring out more of these suburban white voters, more of these young voters, more secular voters, and also get all of them to work on the men in their lives.
Yeah, Ron, I wanted to ask you also about the Western states where so many Californians have
Yeah.
migrated to. You've got Arizona and Nevada, but it seems like Nevada, that Trump has pulled a bit of an edge there, and Harris in Arizona, and both of them have all these California transplants. What's going on in those two states?
Well, Nevada doesn't have Northern Virginia or suburban Philly, right? I mean, uh, why did Virginia go from red to blue in the early, from 2004 to 2008? I always blamed it on Steve Case. Steve Case relocated AOL out to the Dulles access road between DC and the Dulles airport. And now, for anyone who's ever gone to DC and you drive on that road between the Beltway and Dulles, what do you see? Just 10 miles of office buildings with, complex names of companies that we don't know what they do, but they are filled with white, young, or Asian young, or black. Yeah, they're filled with college educated young professionals who are voting Democratic 2-1. That's never happened in Las Vegas. Las Vegas is a very blue collar city. Nevada is a very blue collar town. It's heavily non-college state, excuse me. It's heavily non-college at a time when education polarization is growing. And so it's a tough squeeze for Democrats. Now, I tend to think the Culinary Workers Union always wins the state by 8,500 votes and the Harry Reid machine. And I would bet that if the bottom doesn't fall out for Harris, they will again. Arizona is tougher because, in the Rust Belt swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, you could imagine the college white voters moving further toward the Democrats than they were in 2020. That's harder in the Sun Belt states. Doesn't seem to be happening in at least Georgia and Arizona. Maybe in North Carolina, where you've got the very extreme governor candidate and the 12-week abortion ban. But interestingly, for all the trouble Harris is having nationally with Latino voters, most of the polling in Arizona has her very close to where she has to be. And there the question will be whether she can hold the suburban white McCain kind of Republican, Haley McCain kind of Republican, who voted for Biden in 20, but is now drifting back to Trump. Very different problems in the two states, really. I mean, in Nevada, it's a much, finding a way to appeal to blue collar voters across racial lines, not only white but Latino ones who are moving toward Trump elsewhere. And I think in Arizona the challenge is, I mean, that's there too, but it can be overcome. There's a much bigger white collar Northern Virginia type population in Arizona, but she hasn't quite, and Biden too, before, hasn't quite been able to match what they did among them in 20 or what Kelly and Hobbs did among them in 22.
Let's get to some viewer questions. Just want to remind you, you can put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if you don't mind including, along with your first name, where you're from, I can add that as well. Just nice to give a sense of place. Ruth asks, what roles are Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman playing in pushing Pennsylvania toward the vice president, even in rural areas of the state, especially given the success both men had in rural areas in the 2022 midterms?
They're both helping. I've never wavered in my belief that on October 25th, she will have wished she picked Josh Shapiro. I know there are all sorts of complications with that, but locking down Pennsylvania is the state that both sides consider most likely to be the tipping point. And picking the most popular politician in the state that you most have to win seemed to me like a really compelling argument. Waltz has been kind of an up and down figure as the vice president. He's certainly relatable and enthusiastic. He's had his problems, but like most vice presidents, he's kind of disappeared, vice presidential nominees. I think they're both doing everything they can. I think that she is really focused on, she's done bus tours in red parts of the state. She's gone to red parts of the state. She's in Erie again tonight. I think if she wins, it's because she wins those 4 suburban counties outside Philly by more than Biden did. And Allegheny, and at least does what he did inside Philly itself. Again, they are focused on sanding down losses rather than maximizing strengths, and maybe they have tapped out on the strengths. I don't think so. Fetterman and Shapiro, I could literally grab a piece of paper and double check this, but I'm pretty sure Fetterman and Shapiro did even better than Biden did in 20 in the suburban counties outside of Philly, which is where Biden did significantly better than Hillary did. And I think, you know what? I'm going to just violate all etiquette of
Go right ahead, Rob.
I'm going to look at it And just
Yeah.
so I can say, um, they actually it was exactly the same in the Senate race as the presidential 2 years earlier for Fetterman, as it was for Biden. But I think
Sure.
Shapiro did do better in those counties. So that to me is the key.
Greg has a question I think many of us are asking, and that is, how long do you think it'll take, given how close the election is, to know the result? Particularly, we could have court challenges, recounts.
Yeah.
How protracted?
Well, court challenges and recounts, leaving how long those go aside. Last time they called Pennsylvania on Saturday morning, right? And that was when we called the winner in the media. They called Georgia on Friday night, I think it was. But Pennsylvania was called on Saturday morning, and Biden was called the winner. I was on the air from like midnight to 4 a.m. on CNN on that Friday night, and John Legend had put out a video that day because everybody was waiting for Georgia of Georgia on My Mind, like of him singing Georgia on My Mind. I remember watching it during the commercials on air on that night. But look, I mean, people will be challenging back and forth. Trump's going to obviously be a lot of challenges. It could be a certain amount of chaos. But in the states that matter, there are Democratic governors and Democratic control of uh, of the election administration. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, not in Nevada, although it's Democratic Secretary of State. North Carolina and Georgia could be more complicated. I mean, with Republican, but there's a Democratic governor, obviously, in North Carolina. What happens with these rules by the Georgia election board that is trying to require a hand count? I've got to think courts are going to say that is not possible or acceptable. But last time we knew on Saturday, that's what I would bet.
Marcia.
Even though we didn't know till Saturday, I think we kind of knew by Wednesday night that Biden was very likely to win Pennsylvania. So
Mhm.
yeah, we
It
knew
just it was not formal by
not
that
formal,
point.
not at all.
Marcia asks, what about Republican plans to wreak havoc with counting of the votes, certifying the results, the potential for the election to be driven to Congress under Republican Speaker of the House?
Right. So first of all, as I said, in the states that are most likely to decide the race, Republicans don't have control. Now, could they muck things up in other ways? Maybe, but I think pretty confident that the winner in Michigan is going to be the person who got the most votes, and Wisconsin. I'm not sure. I think. Do you know? I mean, the governor certainly is Democrat. I don't know who the Secretary of State is in Wisconsin. But one thing that the Electoral Count Act reforms that they passed in the lame duck session in 22 did was it made it clear, no confusion. The governor is the final word on certification, like what slate of electors gets sent to Washington. And we're wondering about this same question that you were. I've asked the experts, and what they tell me is that both chambers have to agree to throw out a state's electoral college votes in order for that to happen. And, yes, would Mike Johnson possibly do that? Absolutely. Would every Republican in the House possibly vote to do that if Trump loses? Absolutely. If it's a 51 seat Republican Senate majority, would 51 Republican senators vote to do that? You'd have to hope that if there's no evidence, the answer is no. And I think the answer could be no. I'm not sure Murkowski and Collins would agree to overturn the election without, on spurious grounds. And, I think the evidence is that all the ground, I mean, there are always spurious grounds. Voter fraud is a extremely rare and minimal problem in the US.
We've had a number of viewers who have asked, to what extent do you think U.S. support for Israel will affect the election result?
I think, I mean, there are two ways to look at this. I think that Trump will probably run slightly better among American Jews than he did last time, but not a lot. I mean, the polling is still, he's losing 70% or so of American Jews. Netanyahu and the Netanyahu government is obviously a very divisive, entity, even among American Jews. I don't think that there's anything approaching uniform consensus among American Jews that they are handling, the horror, the horrific event of October 7th, that their response has been appropriate or proportionate or even strategic. So I think he'll make some gain. I think that there with Biden, there would have been a real price on the other end among young people, um, uh, where I think that his, seeming impotence, where he uh, asks Netanyahu to do this or that and gets ignored and then sends him more weapons, I think has been a pretty bad look for Biden. Harris has chosen not to fight that fight. I mean, she obviously had to pick her battles. Um, but with her in the race, I think there's no cost really on the other side of young people, losing enthusiasm for her. Because of that, I think the Muslim American thing in Michigan is really the one big price she might pay for her positioning on this. And I guess I don't think that's quite enough to tip the state. It's more, can she maintain a minimal level of support among working class whites who Trump is going after on the idea that the EV transition is going to kill the domestic auto industry? And can she, as Whitmer did, push further than Biden 2020 in those white collar counties around the state, which are, big populous places? So, yeah, by the way, Biden got 56% in Oakland County. She got 61% in Oakland County. If Harris gets somewhere around 60, 61% in Oakland County, that's probably the pathway to win.
All
Now that
right.
I have a sheet out, I'm competing with it regularly.
Eric in Los Angeles asks, do states with abortion restrictions on the ballot, is that or abortion rights measures, how does that affect the presidential race?
So, one of the pieces I was most proud of, I wrote in 22, pointed out that there was no question that in the purple states, abortion was a big asset for Democrats. Places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, where voters feared losing. In those states, Democrats won very, very high percentages of people who describe themselves as pro-choice. Conversely, in red states that actually restricted abortion, like Ohio, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Iowa, Republicans still won the governorships comfortably. And they won a higher share of people who describe themselves as pro-choice. It wasn't enough to move people who think of themselves as Republicans on things like crime or the immigration or the border or taxes to drop Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis. But it was plenty of a powerful tailwind for Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro and Tony Evers. I think it will help Harris somewhat in Arizona and in Nevada, but those are states that have elements of those red states. I mean, it's not clear that enough Republican women who think Biden has failed on the border are going to vote for Harris on abortion to get her over the top in Arizona. I mean, we're going to find out. It's right. You can't say it's clear that it's not either. I mean, it's like, these are states right at the tipping point, but I think most people would agree that Trump has a slight edge in Arizona.
Clyde asks, what about Harris's ground game? Can't that still make a difference to bring a victory to her?
Totally, totally, absolutely. Especially in these, let's keep in mind that if Harris wins every state that Biden won by 2.6 percentage points or more, which is basically all the states that have voted 4 times Democratic since 2008, except for Nevada, right? So 20 states have voted Democratic since 2008, except for Nevada. If Harris wins all 19 of them, plus Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and that one CD in Omaha, which she is going to win, she'd be exactly at 270 and she would win. Okay. Arizona, some combination. If she loses one of those, you can plug in Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina to replace them. But that is still the clearest path to 270 for her. And I always do the disclaimer here. I am the person who in 2009 coined the phrase the blue wall, right? Which at that point referred to the 18 states that ultimately voted Democratic in all 6 elections from 92 to 2012. Trump famously knocked Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin out of the blue wall in 2020. And that's why he was president. He won them by 80,000 votes. Biden put them back by 260,000 votes. That's why he was president. Interestingly, when people talk about the blue wall now, it's been turned inside out. It's like a reversible raincoat. Most people who talk about the blue wall talk about Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So from my point of view, the places that fell out of the blue wall have become the blue wall, right? but her ground game in those states does seem superior. I mean, Trump has outsourced it to this Elon Musk thing. No one has any idea how that's working. So at the margin, if they went into election day tied, you would have to favor her a little in those states. Plus, as the early vote comes through, we're going to learn more about kind of who's turning out who in those states between now and
Michael,
election day.
Michael says the intensity factor is important and strikes me as important for turnout on each side. How do you gauge the intensity factor in the Trump camp versus the Harris camp?
What a great question. I think it's pretty comparable. I mean, Trump's people really like Trump. I mean, he turns out a lot of irregular voters. But it's a new test now. I mean, we know from 16 and 20 that he is super powered at turning out white, non-college and non-urban voters who don't usually show up. We don't know that whether he has the same capacity to turn out non-regular, non-white voters, and we're going to find that out. And I think Harris has dealt with the enthusiasm gap. I mean, I think there is genuine enthusiasm about her. The size of her crowds are enormous. I wonder. I don't know if any political candidate has ever tried to fill the football stadiums in Madison and Ann Arbor, but I still can imagine Kamala Harris and Taylor Swift there somewhere between now and the finish line.
So this isn't like Hillary Clinton 8 years ago with her kind of dwindling turnout late in
No,
the campaign. This
no,
is a much different
no.
phenomenon. Bob asks, why is Trump spending time in states he's never going to win? He was in Coachella in Southern California. He's been in Colorado, New York. Why is he going to those states?
Part of it's ego, but a big part of it is like, he's the message. I said this summer on a podcast that I thought Trump's message in October would be people who don't look like you are going to come and kill you, and Harris won't stop them. And that's what he's doing. So he's now going to these places, and like he did in Detroit, and saying, "This, look, America, this is what you are. These are the images of democratic failure that you will get unless you elect me. I am the human wall. I am the only thing standing between you and these hordes from the dungeons of the third world," as he's been saying the last few weeks. By the way, one word is the tip-off to me of where they think they're going to win this race, and in fact have made some progress. And I go back to those blue-collar white women in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. When Trump was in Wisconsin 2 weeks ago and talking about this, conjuring this threat of marauding bands of undocumented immigrants who are going to kill you, he said, "They'll come in your kitchen and they'll cut your throat." He didn't say they'll come in your front door or they'll come into your living room where a man might be. He said they'll come into your kitchen where, in a lot of working class families, a woman will be preparing dinner alone. The guy isn't standing there next to her chopping. And to me, that one word, kitchen, was like the tip-off that Trump thinks he can pull back the former blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by raising fears, principally among these women, but also fairly among the men, that Harris presidency will endanger them. And she's got to find a way to the comeback is partially, yeah, and I'll be tough on the border, all that reassurance. But really, the more effective comeback is potentially that Trump is threatening to them in a different kind of way, that he will introduce disorder and chaos and dissension and neighbor against neighbor and maybe even violence in your community. That's the thread that has almost completely fallen out of her argument. And it is one I have trouble imagining. I mean, I shouldn't say that. She can get over the top with what she's doing. That is totally possible. Like reassuring enough suburban Republican-leaning white voters in those states. Great ground game, as somebody was saying. Yes, you can squeeze out Michigan, Pennsylvania, and win the presidency the track she's on. But it is, I think, a riskier path than not reminding more voters about what they found so risky about Trump in the first place.
Ron, I want to get to just as many viewer questions because we're into the home stretch. We have like 3 minutes left.
All right. Yep.
Eric asks, what about the House and the Senate? What do you anticipate in majorities there?
Yeah, really hard for Democrats to hold the Senate. The 3 states that they're defending, that they're down to 3 senators out of the 50 in the 25 states Trump won in 2020. You're likely to lose all three of them. It's not clear that there's something else they can make up. It would be Texas or Florida. I think the House, the winner of the presidency most likely wins the House, but it is possible, given how many of the critical districts are in New York and California, that you could see a separation there. If Harris wins the presidency, I think Democrats will win the House. If Trump wins, there may still be a path for Democrats to squeeze it out.
All right. Let's see. Let me ask about, Paul asks, is the gerrymandering initiative in Michigan going to have an effect there?
Can't say I'm following that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm
I
not
don't think it'll
familiar
affect the
with,
presidential. I don't think it'll affect the
Okay.
presidential. It'll affect, future congressional and state legislative, but not the presidential.
Okay. And we have Judge Joe wanted to ask about polls and how are people reached, given that comparatively few people still have landlines, how do they get valid samples selected?
Yeah, it's now in a let a thousand flowers bloom stage. I mean, different pollsters have different mechanisms. They combine landline, cell phone, online, text. They do, even as important as any of those mechanisms are, do they wait back to the 2020 result, which some pollsters are doing now as a way of trying to ensure they don't undercount the blue collar whites who like Trump so much. Other pollsters are not, like that New York Times Siena poll that came out over the weekend with Harris still leading in Pennsylvania fairly comfortably. It was a +8 Biden 2020 vote sample. It's highly unlikely that the actual election day is going to be +8 Biden from 2020. So people are struggling. They have really made a lot of adjustments to try to adapt for the fact that they undercounted Trump's blue collar support in 16 and 20. And again, we'll find out on election day. I go back to what I said before. If polls are telling you that one candidate is winning a state by a point or the other one is losing a state by a point, we're not talking surgery here. They can't tell you who's going to win that election. That campaign is not only within the margin of error, as someone once said to me, it is within the margin of effort. And
Lisa,
if people are worried about polls showing Harris or Trump 1 or points apart in a state, the best thing to do is not just scroll the poll. The best thing to do is to, invest some time in the state.
Lisa says she's heard that huge numbers of young people are registering. She wonders if they're included in likely voters in the polls. And I'd kind of tag along, it used to mean if a bunch of young people are registering to vote, they were likely reliably Democratic. But with the majority of young men seeming to go into the Trump camp, is that even predictable at this point?
So she's asking a question that a lot of people are asking, and they don't really have a 100% answer. If there's a surprise on the upside for Democrats, it'll be more young people participating than the polls suggested. Yes, young men are voting more Trump than they did in 2020, but I think Harris is still winning most of them. And she is in the 70s among young women. I mean, the young woman rejection of Trump is so overwhelming that if there is a election day surprise for Harris, that is probably what it's going to be. More young women than pollsters have counted showing up to vote against Trump. And young like 35, not only 25 and below, but like 35.
Yeah. Ron, please just share with us very briefly your closing thoughts about what we're apt to see over the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there are a lot of people on the Democratic side of America, blue America, who cannot imagine how we are in this circumstance, where a guy who triggered a violent insurrection, who is spouting the most openly racist and xenophobic language of a presidential candidate really ever. I mean, even George Wallace, was more veiled than this. How is he on the brink? Then you kind of turn it around, and there are Republicans who say, well, you've got basically 60 to 65% of all Americans across racial lines without a college degree feeling like they are worse off than they were when Biden took office, or that his policies have not helped them. All of these factors kind of push us toward the place that we are in. Harris is very likely to win the popular vote. Democrats will have won at 8 of 9 at that point. No party has ever done that since the formation of the modern party system in 1828. But these swing states are right on the knife's edge. And if there is any movement in the last couple of weeks, Democrats are worried that it is a glacial but real movement toward Trump. The phrase that keeps going through my head is that these are states that are not only within the margin of error, they are within the margin of effort. So if people believe that a second Trump term could be catastrophic for the country, they have an obligation to do what they can to try to prevent that. I am struck that someone like General Milley would say to Bob Woodward, apparently, that he is fascist to the core. Is he going to be on 60 Minutes between now and Election Day? All of the institutions, and as I said, I don't think Harris has done enough to ring the bell of alarm about what a second Trump term would mean, but she's not running alone. I mean, there are a lot of people and institutions out there with a platform and a voice. And for those who think that this could take the country into a dangerous and dark place, it's a really speak now or forever hold your peace kind of moment.
Ron, thank you. As always, we so appreciate your mastery of the complexities of what's happening with elections. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your analysis. And we'll look forward to having you back soon to talk about what happens after the election. Thank you.
It's always great to be with you. Thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you.
for providing this forum. And everybody, thanks for tuning in.
Ron Brownstein, thank you so much. And thank you for watching tonight. Please support the America to Crossroads programs, which give you this kind of insight, this kind of depth and analysis of what's happening in American politics and government. You can make a tax-deductible contribution at Jews United for Democracy.org. That's Jews United for Democracy.org. And thank you for your support. Next Monday, Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn will provide his harrowing account of January 6th. He'll be in conversation with Pat Morrison. The following night, next Tuesday, there's going to be a conversation between Warren Olney and the Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin. She'll be talking about the home stretch of the campaign with Warren. That's a week from tomorrow night. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a very good holiday season coming up for those of you that observe the holidays later this week. And for all of us in America at a Crossroads, good night.